Hello everyone, Reza here with another Unreal Engine tutorial. Today we're kicking off part 1 of a deep dive into Substrate shading model in Unreal Engine. Substrate is an incredibly powerful tool for physically based rendering, giving you the ability to create highly realistic materials. In this session, we will focus on the Substrate Slab BSDF. This feature is key to creating complex materials because it allows multiple layers to interact with light the way that mimic real-world surfaces. This tutorial is designed with beginners in mind, so whether you're just starting with Substrate or looking to solidify your foundation, you're in the right place. And don't worry, next time we will ramp things up as we dive into more advanced techniques. Let's jump in and get started. Substrate in Unreal Engine 5 introduces a more flexible and modular material system, replacing the fixed shading models and blend modes like default lit and clear coat. This system also simplifies the process of layering materials, making it easier to represent complex surfaces such as liquid on metal or clear coat over subsurface scattering. And you know better than me that these type of materials are not easy to make in Unreal Engine. To understand Substrate, we first need to explore Substrate Slab and its role. The Substrate Slab is the fundamental unit for building substrate materials in Unreal Engine 5, designed to cover a wide range of material appearances. A slab consists of two main components: the interface, where light interacts with the surface, and the medium, where light is scattered, transmitted, or perhaps absorbed. The interface's properties are defined by familiar parameters like diffuse, roughness, and anisotropy, while the medium's properties are controlled by mean free path or MFP inputs. Each slab can be customized with various attributes such as diffuse, specular, emissive, so on and so forth, to make the system more flexible and expressive. Now we understand what substrate material is, let's have a look at how to enable substrate in Unreal Engine. Here I am inside the engine. To enable substrate materials in your project, you simply navigate to Edit, you go to Project Settings, you scroll down all the way to Engine, and you find Rendering. Under Rendering, there is a rollout just for Substrate. There are 3 settings to enable. We need to understand the role of them, and there are few gotcha moments that you need to know about. The first one is Substrate Materials. I'm going to enable that, and as soon as I do that, the engine asks for me to restart it, which we will. There is a second one, Substrate Opaque Material Rough Refraction. And when you enable that, any rough surfaces that you have over other materials can blur the layers beneath them realistically. So it enhances the way that the light refracts and shows underneath layers. Definitely a helpful setting. I'm going to enable that as well. And then we have this last one, Substrate Advanced Visualization Shader. Now, enabling this option creates shader for advanced debugging views. Remember that these shaders can also slow down your performance. So you need to only turn them on if you need to debug substrate material topology. I tend to leave this off unless I want to debug my shader. So that's the first gotcha. The second one is DirectX. If I type in DirectX, you can see my default RHI is set to DirectX 12. Now, you may know what DirectX is. Basically, it provides direct access to your hardware, allowing for kind of more efficient use of resources like your graphics card. It's an API developed by Microsoft, and since Unreal Engine is on Windows, we need to have DirectX enabled. Now, here's the catch. You need to make sure that you have DirectX 12 because DirectX 11 is very buggy and unstable with Substrate. So definitely make sure that you have the right version of DirectX so you have no issues when it comes to stability. Now, before I restart my engine, I'm going to intentionally create a material. I have MM default, and if I double click on it, this is a good old default monolithic material root node that we all know and love. I'm just going to intentionally give this a color. The reason I'm doing this is I want to show you what's going to happen if you have a monolithic material root node and convert everything into Substrate. Remember that as soon as I go restart, the entire shader engine converts to Substrate. So you no longer have access to this type of material root node. I'm going to go restart. Now here I am inside the engine. Let's go ahead and open the old material that we created, and you may realize that this material has now been converted into Substrate shading model. Any existing material that you have are automatically converting to Substrate material when you open them for editing in a Substrate enabled project. Now here's the gotcha moment. This conversion is permanent and cannot be reverted to a non-Substrate material. So if you want to hold on to your old material, then you need to make sure you have backups of your materials inside the project directory. Also, if for whatever reason you disable Substrate in your project so it's no longer Substrate enabled, any Substrate material that you have will render out black. So that's another thing that you need to be careful about. You either work with Substrate enabled project or you're not. You cannot mix and match and have both. All right, with that out of the way, let's actually start the lesson by looking into main Substrate components, and we're going to start easy and building up the knowledge as we move forward through the tutorial. All right, let's start simple. Let's start by creating just a simple Substrate material and just look at its components and make the simplest result possible. I'm going to go into my content. By the way, I got this model from the engines folder and engine mesh, SM matte preview mesh, and that's the static mesh that I'm going to use to apply Substrate materials to. I'm going to go into content, and I'm going to get rid of the old material that I had, and let's create a brand new material. I'm going to call that MM for master material, Substrate, simple. Let's open that up. Just going to toggle that, move that in here. And right off the bat, you may have noticed that we have Substrate UE4 default shading. This is what we called standard shading, or PBS, physically based shading. This shader is useful and it's designed to simulate realistic lighting and material in a physically accurate manner. But to tell you the truth, that is not really the node that you use more often than not. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to press Tab and I'm going to type in Substrate slab. This is what we talked about in the previous chapter, that has got two different sections, interface and the medium. Whereas with this one, we're mainly dealing with good old typical attributes. It's a bit safer to use this in terms of knowledge base, whereas this one, you can see it looks a bit alien. Some of these inputs don't make much sense, but we will talk about them, we will go through them and make use of them, benefit from them. I'm going to hold down Alt and just replace the node DF, and we can get rid of this default UE4 standard shading for now. Now, right off the bat, there is something that I would like to mention with regard to this front material in our Substrate Simple. And just keep that in mind that all substrate materials, whether you have one of these or 10 of these, must be connected to the front material input on this material root node. We call this material root node. That's one thing. The second thing is, if I select this material root node, you can see I also have blend mode and material domain and shading model. You can see this shading model is now disabled because we no longer deal with the monolithic material root node. We're dealing with Substrate. That's why this is turned off. And Substrate uses its own set of blend modes to define how materials color is blended with the background. Legacy materials, the old way of doing things, are very limited in terms of blending with one to another, and that actually results in limiting the type of material you can create with legacy materials. That's not the case with Substrate. We have many to choose from and they're actually extremely powerful. We are going to play around with some of these blend modes, but for now we're going to leave that as opaque. The idea behind this material is to keep things simple. Now we have some familiar names: diffuse albedo. We all know that diffuse albedo is the percentage of light that reflects diffusely from a surface. Similar to base color of the material, you can assign a 3 vector to that. So let's go and pick a color, and then I can assign the color and see the result just like a normal base color. Then we have F0. F0 defines the color and brightness of specular highlights when the surface is perpendicular to the camera. What does that mean? It means that if we look directly to this shader, any specularity that we see will be around this area, because this area is perpendicular to our eyes and to our camera. If I look over here, then this area will be my F0 area. If I look at here, this area will be F0 of my area. So you can assign a value, a simple constant value to that, or you can give this a color if you want to. So if I go in here and let's pick a reddish color or orange color, then I will get this area as this color, where the base color is blue. If I go and turn off blue, then all I see is F0. Now you may say, okay, so it's kind of covering the whole area. Does that mean that we can assign something else to the edges when we move away from F0? The answer is yes. We have F90 for it. And this is the color of the specular highlights at the glazing angle relative to the camera. In a simpler term, this would be the color of specularity that we catch around the edges of the model. So if I go and let's say give this one a green color, and I'm going to go OK and go F90, then we have a little bit of green color around the edges now, because that's where the F90 is. Of course, we have roughness, so we can go in there and apply roughness, make it glossier. And as soon as you make it glossier, then it's much easier to see F90 compared to F0. So these two can actually drive the color of your model. Now, there's one big question, and that is, Reza, hang on a second. This turned metallic. I did not specify any metalness here. Why did it turn metallic? That also brings up another question. Where is the metallic input? Now, there are two ways that we have to deal with metalness in Substrate. The first and easier way is to use just a simple constant, holding down 1, left click. Value of 0 is non-metallic appearance, and value of 1 is metallic appearance that you apply to F1. But by doing so, you actually lose the color. So wouldn't that be nice to have these two in one sort of a function or module? Well, we have just that, and it's called Substrate metalness to diffuse albedo. So if I type in Substrate metalness, that's the only one that comes up under Substrate helpers. And this Substrate helpers category is a massive help to so many functionalities, and we use that a lot in the advanced video. So let's bring that in and look at that. We have base color, which is our base color, and we have metalness, which I can now move from here to here. And all I need to do is just to plug F0 to F0 and albedo to albedo. And we are getting the exact same result. It eliminates the need of base color, because realistically our base color was our F0 to some degree. And now we have metalness, it's just separate module, which can easily parameterize for our metalness, and base color that can also be parameterized for our base color. Now, that was the simplest form of Substrate, and let's move on to the next chapter. That's the easiest example I could think of. I'm going to take it up a notch and add more bits and pieces to what we have right now. Now we know how to create a simplest form of Substrate using F0 and F90. Let's take it up a notch and create something like this, which is more like a soap bubble or iridescent surfaces. This is actually fairly straightforward. We are going to use some really useful nodes here. So I am going to remove that. We are going to make that from scratch. Let's go ahead into our Substrate materials folder and create a brand new material, and I'm going to call that film underscore thin. I'm going to double click, bring my material pane and dock it right next to main. We all know that we are not going to use the UE4 default shader, so I'm going to create Substrate slab instead. Connect that into the front material. Now let's take care of the default color albedo, and default color albedo can be anything. So I'm going to pick blue this time, so it looks slightly different to what I showed you. And then we're dealing with F0 and F90. Now with F0 and F90, we are going to use a brand new node called Substrate Thin Film. And the name suggests its functionality. It's going to create a sort of thin film interference, but which again, as I said, it looks like soap bubble, oil slick, or any type of iridescent surface. Specular color, we already know that our specular color is our F0. Edge specular color, we know that the edges will get controlled by F90, so that's that. We're going to take care of that. Let's plug some values in for F0. I'm going to hold down 1, and we're going to give this a value. It has to be a very subtle value, something between, I don't know, 0.01 to 0.09. We don't want to go too overboard. And based on the product that you're creating, you also need to think about index of refraction, because any thin film sort of look has got a degree of index of refraction. Air is 1, water is 1.33, diamond is 2.4. I'm going to give it something like 1.8, which is more like an oil. So it is for you to study what type of look you want to get. And then we have thickness. For thickness, I'm going to use a lerp node, linear interpolate node. The good thing about lerp node is you always get 2 values, but also you get alpha, which we are going to use. So I'm going to sort of reduce this down to a very, very low value here, but we are going to play around with it if you're not getting a good result. And that goes, this alpha goes into a component mask. We need to pick a channel. So for now, I'm going to pick blue, but it can be any channel. And then let's start making some nodes in here and plug that into our component mask. To get gradient look, I always use absolute world position in conjunction with object position. So absolute world position provides an absolute position of each pixel or vertex that you may have in world space coordinates. So I'm going to type in absolute world. Well, actually, I'm going to type in world position because I think absolute is not part of the name when you search for it. You've got XYZ, XY, and Z. So it kind of thinks about what coordinates we want to sort of work with. We definitely want to work with XYZ, that's for sure. And then another one that I always add is object position. Object position, WS. We need to subtract this from this. In case if you don't know what object position is, and I did talk about this node in my previous lessons, it positions the object's origin in world space. It's particularly useful for animating effects, distance-based type of effects, which partially is part of the gradient look that we are going to have. You need to subtract this from this. So subtract. I'm going to move that up. A goes to XYZ, B goes to object position. Now it's time to bring a brand new node called object bounds. Now object bounds is the key to create gradient effects or sometimes procedural effects that you might have. It creates a virtual bounding box dimensions for your object in world space. We need to divide this by the result of that. So I'm going to type in divide. A goes to the output and B gets controlled by our object bound. And these guys are going to go into a node called constant bias scale. Constant bias scale is more like a filter or mediator. So the role of this node is to adjust values by adding a bias, like offsetting, and then scaling, which is more like a multiplying the result. Every time you want to modify a value, like adjusting your texture coordinates or color values, it's going to be extremely helpful. So I'm going to place that here. By the way, the way that you see the bias and the scale is in here. So this bias is offset and this scale is multiply. Now I think the job is done. We just need to make sure that our values are clamped, and I'm going to use the cheapest method that exists to be just memory efficient, and that is Saturate. Saturate is a great node to sort of be very efficient with clamping values between 0 to 1. You want to ensure that values remain within certain range, otherwise things will get out of control. So Saturate, and there's not much in there to tweak. It basically balances the values automatically, and that goes into your component mask. And look at that. As soon as I apply that, you get a really cool result. I can go in there and perhaps change that to another color, and you can see the type of result that you're getting is quite different. So I'm going to kind of go with that for now, but one thing that is missing, which looks a bit jarring to be honest with you, is the roughness. I didn't specify any roughness values for it, so let's do it, but do it in a slightly fancy way. I just don't want to put a scalar value in there. Let's make it a little bit more exciting. I'm going to create a lerp node. And again, I use that here for the same reason I'm using it here. It gives you the values that you want to control the black points and the white points, and it gives you alpha to bring an image. So why not using that? So that goes in there. We will adjust the roughness, but first let's bring in our texture. I have this one right here, compress without alpha, ticked because we're not using alpha. Show final encode. Gives you the highest quality, and more importantly sRGB off, because it's a data map, not a color map. So anything that you bring, make sure sRGB is off. So we don't need to bring RGB, we can just bring a single point into alpha, and let's see if we get any results. Ooh, it's a bit too much, so let's just balance it out a little bit. Maybe this one is 0.3, this one is 0.6. Let's see what we get. Yeah, that's kind of more like it. If I put 0.8, do I blur everything? No, that's good. And maybe 0.2 in here. And again, these are the things that you can adjust to your taste and get the result that you want. In the example I showed you, I picked this type of color. You can see it's very sort of bubbly, soap bubbly type of look. You can definitely use that as well. Or you can use blue or any color that you want. And if I go into my material and apply, we get the result. And looks absolutely beautiful. So that's another type of use of Substrate. You can see we gradually but surely move it up the level of difficulty, but I hope this hasn't been too much of a problem, since we really didn't play around with too many new nodes, and hopefully this is something that you can kind of use in your own projects. Let's go to the next chapter and learn more about Substrate. Now let's crank up the difficulty, and again we have another type of substrate material that we are going to introduce, and that is this one right here. Looks cool. So the difference with that type of material, which I really wanted to show you guys, at least at the beginner level, you need to know about this, is the use of more than one substrate slab. That's the first difference. And use of glint and MFP, which we did not cover in our previous chapters. So let's have a look at what we can blend to Substrate slab first, and few bits and pieces along the way. I try to use these as an excuse to introduce more useful functions and nodes to you guys, so you kind of get a hang of a situation before we dive into anything too advanced. So I'm going to select this guy as usual. I'm going to wipe it out. I'm going to go to our material, and let's create a material node from scratch. I'm going to call that glint. How predictable. Cool. We know what to do, at least for the first few steps. Getting rid of substrate U4 and create substrate slab. That's the first one. Let's create another one. The reason I'm using two, because you may ask why you're using two. Can we just do all of it in one? Well, what I'm doing, at least in here, if I can sort of undo, I'm adding flakes and glints on top of one of these guys. So the top substrate slab is going to be just something very simple. And then we are going to use these glint density and glint UV to add something on top of it. So that's why in this particular example, we're using two substrate slab. And there are some common examples on layering substrate materials. And as soon as you sort of crank up the level of complexity, you soon realize that one substrate slab is not going to do the trick for you. That's why. All right, cool. I'm going to remove that again. And let's start by blending these two. How can we blend two substrate slab materials? Well, the easiest way to do that, there are multiple ways, but the easiest way is to use something called substrate vertical layer. It's got the top, which goes to top, and bottom, which goes to bottom. And then we need to do something about this top thickness, and that's our blend. So it kind of shifts from one side to another side, or stays in the middle to have both materials. Very straightforward. And that goes into front material. Another role of this node is to control how different material properties like diffuse or specular or subsurface scattering blend or interact when stacked vertically. So you can see we have sort of diffuse here, diffuse there. We are going to talk about transmission very soon. Another role of this node is to kind of control that, and it does a beautiful job. In general, substrate vertical layer kind of allows us to create more realistic and intricate materials, which they're mainly multi-layered surfaces or complex composites. Okay, enough with that. Let's actually create the easy bit, because, well, the simplest way of creating a surface is by adding some sort of coat and take care of the normals in the underneath layer. So first things first, no color is needed. So the result is going to be black in here because we want the glint to take over and sort of have the textures that it deserves. Although you can just give it any color that you want, but remember that will be shown underneath the glint, which may not be visually pleasing to the eye. I'm going to give it a little bit of roughness. Maybe start with something glossy-ish, 1.2 maybe. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, it looks good. So that's that. Then we are going to take care of the normal. We want to give it some bumpiness, makes it look more interesting. Doesn't need to be there necessarily, but I think just an interesting normal map will get the job done. As for the texture, I believe there's one called T-shaped normal, which is part of the engine normal map. You can of course use a fancy one, but that should really do the trick. I'm going to really quickly make it tileable by adding a coordinates to it, texture coordinates, feeding it to multiply and into UVs, Perhaps I'm going to give that 4, or you can have a constant and parameterize it. Let's see how it looks. Well, that should do it. So that's normal. Then for the very first time, we're going to use that SSMFP. Now, with subsurface or anything transmissive, you need to find a way to make the light penetrate and gets into the surface, because that's really not the case. So far, we have not done that yet. And every time you want to bring any type of translucency or transmissive type of attributes, you have a module that you can always use and rely on. And that is called Substance Transmittance to MFP. So if I type in Substrate Transmittance to MFP, that's the one that we always use every time we want to sort of bring a little bit of transmission and play around with this type of nature of this physical attribute on our shader. And this thickness that we have for our top layer goes into, remember we talked about top thickness? There you go. That is going to do the trick for us. As for this color, let's create a white color. We're not going to see much of a difference here because, well, we haven't started using glints and our second layer here. So chances are we're not going to see much, but I'm going to feed that into base color. So we get a white color that I think should do the trick. At any point of time, you can go and change those. And for the second color, I'm going to again use a trick I used in the previous chapter. You can see I'm kind of rinsing and repeating these old tricks. I'm going to bring in a lerp node, linear interpolate, goes into B, and I can use a texture for the alpha, the exact same method that I used for roughness in the previous chapter. I find these randomizations very effective and useful. I believe, again, there is another noise that is available called low-res blurred noise. We might actually use that. That should really do the trick for us. And that kind of breaks up the pattern that we feed into transmitted color. Okay, that, believe it or not, that is going to do the trick for our first shader. I'm going to move it up ever so slightly and organize it. And let's focus on the second one. Right off the bat, we need 3 scalars for our diffuse albedo, for our F0, and for our glint density, because, well, it's a scalar, it's a float value, scalar value. So let's connect that in. And if you don't know what to apply to float density, that's totally fine. I'm going to just put something random, like, I don't know, 5, because we can always change that. This, as I mentioned, has to be somewhat subtle. It's your specularity for the flakes, and I want the flakes to be super shiny. So for specularity, I'm going to crank it up all the way. And for the color, I really don't want to include any color. We get the color handled by MFP here. So that's the easy bit. Now let's go to the only attribute that we need to take care of, and that is glint UV. Now, because I'm going to use UVs, I need to make sure that my vertex normals are positioned correctly. That is a very, very vital step every time you're dealing with UV. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of room here, and I am going to actually start with my vertex normal data input. And there's really not much in there. It's really essential for creating effects and to rely on the correct orientation of your normals on the surface in a 3D world. Anytime you want to add reflection, refraction, and normal mapping, this is an inseparable part of the whole workflow. Then I'm going to use something called transform vector. Now, what is transform vector? It's some sort of a conversion system. It's there to convert one space into another space. And if I click on this little arrow here, right now it's going to convert tangent space into world space, which is really not what we want to do. We're not really interested in tangent space. We want to actually change world space into local space, because the way that the camera orients around the character, it's based on the local orientation in the 3D environment. So we are going to connect that in as well. And then what we have is three components: RGB, XYZ. That's why we're dealing with normals, right? But eventually that goes into UVs, and we need to somehow find a way to break out this X and Y and Z, which are going to be represented by R and G and B. And for that, I can use a function called breakout float 3D component. This function is a native function available in Unreal Engine. You can see it receives a float, and this float can be XYZ, it can be RGB, and then it gives you separate inputs of R and G and B. Extremely useful. I can kind of intensify that by using a multiply node if I want to. So if you want to, you can go, this is totally optional, you know, you can go A and B and the result goes to float. You can even repeat the process after the second one as well, and then you have your RGB. All right, hopefully that one was easy to understand. At the same time, I want to be mindful of my absolute world position, and I did talk about absolute world position in the previous chapter, so I don't need to really talk about it again. World position, absolute world position, and that goes into transform position. So transform position, very similar to transform vector, is going to act as a conversion. If I type in transform position, it's used to transform position from one space to another space. And the good thing about it is it works with absolute world position, whereas transform vector, which is like a twin brother of transform position, works with vertex normal WS. You can see this kind of a rinse and repeat similar workflow that we are using here. Let's check what we're converting to what. So it's kind of is the same thing. So we are going to go with world space into local space. Not much really has changed with the mindset or our strategy behind making this shader right here. And then we need to break it down again into three main components. And to do that, I'm going to use component mask. I want to keep two channels, not just one channel, and I will explain why. So I'm going to create component masks, and three of them, 1 and 2 and 3. Let's make the first one R and G. Let's leave that as is. For the second one, I can go G and B. And for the third one, I can go R and B. And now let's connect them in, because soon enough we are going to introduce if statements, and these an if statement actually asks for these values. We need to be sure that our calculation is correct. So far so good, no issues with that. Let's bring in our if node. In general, we need three if node conditions. So 1 and 2. And the third one is going to be defining what's going to happen if A is greater than B and what's going to happen if A is smaller than B. So that part is kind of easy. What if A is greater than B? And what if A is smaller than B? And the result will go into the glint UV. At the moment it's erroring out, obviously, because there's not much in there. There's no connection after this point. So we need to kind of make that adjustment. Now that's where it gets a little bit hairy, but I'm sure you can just follow along. Just repeat what I'm doing here and you should be fine. It kind of took me a while to get that set up, but as long as you follow this, you should be all safe. For R and G, I'm going to zoom in just a hair so you kind of see what's going on. For R and G, we want to make sure that it gets plugged to A greater than B. For G and B, we want to make sure that it's connected to A greater than B. And for R and B component mask, we want to make sure that it's connected to both A smaller than B on the second if node and A greater than B in the first if node. Hopefully you're still with me. No one's having a heart attack. Now with the top one, we also need to make some adjustment and feed that into these two, since this one is kind of set up right here. So for channel R, we want to make sure that channel R goes straight into B. Also, we want channel R to go straight into A, the second if node. For G, we want to make sure that is plugged to this B right here in the first conditional statement. We also want to make sure that it's connected to B right here. So RGB, or R, went to B on the third conditional statement, and it went to B for the second conditional statement. For G, it went to B on both first and second conditional statements. What about B, or blue channel? Well, we want to make sure that it goes to A on the first conditional statement, and we want to make sure that it also goes to A on the third conditional statement. And as soon as you do that, you get to see the result. Yay! We have the flakes. I'm going to apply. I'm going to save. By the way, it's a very good idea to turn them into material instance, since you've been waiting for compiling the shader. Always a great idea. Let's go ahead and assign our glint in here. And that looks beautiful. If you want to somehow change the density, you sure can. So we might as well change that to something slightly higher. Let's go back. For the glint, I might go density of 7. And that kind of looks better, definitely. What if I go super high? Yeah, I kind of lose them. Oh, actually, it's not too bad. Let's go 10. I like that. So you can apply backdrops to these guys if you want to, if you feel like it allows you to kind of help you to understand things better. So I can select these guys. I can press C, give this a different color, and I kind of name that clear coat, because that's exactly what this backdrop does. And I can select these guys, and I can call that, hold down C, press C on your keyboard, call that glint, because, well, that's the main functionality of this one right here. I can make that sort of light red-ish type of color. And we're all good. Now, one thing is left, and that is to give it a little bit of specularity color. You may have noticed I did not give this F any color, and I did not give the second substrate slab any type of color, because I wanted to show you a really, really cool way of doing that, and that is through specular profile. If I select any of these guys, you can see you can create subsurface profile or specular profile, which allows you to specify what sort of coloration you would like to get every time the light interacts with these guys, with these flakes and with these glints. Very, very cool stuff. If I go in here and right click in material, right down here I have specular profile and I have subsurface profile. I want to give the secondary substrate slab a specular profile. So I'm going to call that SP for specular profile, and I'm going to call that glint. If I double click, you get this UI, which to me looks pretty cool. And you can get very creative. There is no right or wrong here. I can somehow make this one orange blue. You have view color and you have light color. So I'm gonna pick two opposite colors for the view, something like this. And for the light color, I'm gonna include a variation of this color here, like for example, a little bit of magenta, and perhaps move that in ever so slightly to fill this gap. And let's make it yellow. I don't know, really, there's no right and wrong here. I'm winging it, so to speak. So I'm going to select the second one, and I'm going to select SP glint. And look at that, looks absolutely gorgeous. So there are so many things that you can do with this glint right here. I can kind of introduce a different color in here just to show you. I can go a little bit crazy with green, and as soon as I save, I should be able to get a little bit of green color in here. So if I move the light, you can see how it interacts. The center is now green, as you can see, and if I go around the edges, that's where we see the view color. So this orange look, orange color kind of pops. And when I go, this is my like F0, this is like F90 around the edges. So up to you really what you want to do. This is what we have eventually. I've gone ahead and made minor changes to our setup. So starting with the F0 for the secondary straight slab, I increased the value of 1 to 2, so we get more specularity. About the glint density, I actually lowered the value of 5 to value of 3. And one last change I made, which is not quite noticeable, is I increased the tile of our normal map. Also, one thing that you can do to really bring out these type of flakes is to go ahead in your specular profile and increase the value. So I increased the value of this one to 4, made a few changes with regards to the colors, increased this one to a value of 2, increased this one, I increased the value, which is kind of the intensity, to 3, and this one stayed in 1. And if I Control L to start changing the direction of the light, we can see the glints react to the direction of the light. This is the first part of Substrate material, the beginner's guide. I still have a few bits and pieces to share with you. We didn't get a chance to look at the blend mode of the material root node and few tweaks and hacks that you can use to create stunning looking substrate materials in Unreal Engine. As usual, thank you very much for your support, and I hope you found this video useful. If you come up with something cool, please let me know in the comments. I read all the comments and try to respond as many as I possibly can. And all the cool ones always make my day. So again, thank you for your support. As always, you can follow me on X, Reddit, and Instagram. Have a great rest of your day. Until the next video, see you guys later.